I'm about to dash through a whole lot of very important history. Forgive me. At the end of the 15th century, the 1400s, the great centers of Renaissance art, Flanders in the north, Florence in the south, were conquered by expanding national empires. Even Rome was invaded by both France and the Holy Roman Empire. Spain, enriched by gold from the New World, became Europe's wealthiest power. Meanwhile, the pace of the commercial revolution heated up as wealthy merchants took advantage of expanding worldwide trade, new inventions, and the reintroduction of a money economy. This meant that the base of patronage expanded significantly. The church still commissioned a lot of art, at least until Protestants grew suspicious of church decoration, when church patronage fell off somewhat in the north. But a rising middle class developed a huge appetite for portraits, for landscapes, and for still lifes and genre paintings, or paintings of everyday life. Today we're traveling north from Italy to what today we call Germany. But at this point in our story, what would become Germany, as well as chunks of what would become Italy, Switzerland, Austria, the Czech Republic, and a few other countries as well, was part of the huge Holy Roman Empire. Europe was also heading into the Reformation and the Age of Religious Wars, but we're not there just yet. We'll be there by the end of this lecture. Our first of today's required works was completed the year before Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses, or criticisms of the Catholic Church, to the wall of a church in Wittenberg, Germany, and ignited this Protestant Reformation. It is a very Catholic work, and therefore it serves as a useful contrast to the Protestant works we'll be examining soon. The two towering figures of the German Renaissance are the Catholic Matthias Grünewald and the Protestant Albrecht Dürer. We'll begin with Grünewald. Matthias Grünewald was court painter to the Archbishop of Mainz, and he created this altarpiece for a monastic order. The altarpiece was placed in the choir of a church adjacent to a hospital, and that's why it features saints associated with disease, especially St. Anthony, the patron saint of the order. And this is also why its narrative message focuses sharply on miraculous healing and on the dangers of ignoring God's judgment and therefore endangering that healing. Grünewald was a master of this new oil medium, and as you look at his work, pay special attention to how he uses color subtly to model his figures and shockingly to create contrast between good and evil and the saved and the damned. Here you see the closed altarpiece with its supporting predella, a term you need to know. The closed altarpiece has images of St. Anthony and St. Sebastian on either wing, portrayed as painted sculpture. On the predella, we see Mary and her dead son, a pietà, just after a deposition or removal of Christ from the cross. This could also be classified as a lamentation. These terms show up in College Board questions, and you do need to know them. Note that John the Baptist appears on the other side of the cross from Mary and St. John. Of course, John the Baptist was already dead at the time of the crucifixion, but Grünewald has chosen to make him symbolically present, pointing to the salvation that he had proclaimed. A sacra conversazione is a term for paintings that portray biblical even when they were not, in fact, alive at the same time. We also see the lamb carrying a cross, another symbol of Christ's sacrifice. These, by the way, are among the elements that will disappear from Protestant Christian art. Protestants generally did not portray non-biblical saints, and they tended to be persnickety about scriptural accuracy. They were also less inclined to employ symbolism or to paint chronologically challenged sacra conversaziones. The closed altarpiece presents one of the most vivid and gruesome depictions of Calvary, Christ's crucifixion, in art history. So let's go quickly to two close-ups, first of Christ's head and then of his body, and you'll understand why I say this. The Order of St. Anthony operated the hospital in Isenheim largely for those afflicted by a disease known at the time as St. Anthony's fire, caused by a fungus in rye and other cereals. Doctors now call that disease ergotism, and thankfully it's become rare. But in this period of the Little Ice Age, periodic epidemics still erupted in Europe, where grains were often stored in damp conditions. St. Anthony's fire set off painful skin eruptions that blackened and turned gangrenous, often requiring amputation. The eruptions were accompanied by nervous spasms and convulsions, and many of the victims died. The monks treated victims with a balm made from herbs and other plants, and with prayers to St. Anthony, who was believed to possess miraculous curing powers. The monks also tried to bolster the faith of the sick by reminding them that Christ, and also St. Anthony, had suffered even greater torments. So Grünewald's altarpiece played an important religious and psychological role in the Isenheim treatment program. I've shown you this German Gothic image several times, but note how similar the expressive emotional language of the work is to Grünewald's altarpiece. I could easily imagine the College Board pairing these two works. Heavily emotional content and physical exaggeration will continue to appear in German art well into the 20th century. The outer wings of the Isenheim altarpiece were opened for important festivals of the liturgical year, particularly those that honored the Virgin Mary. The scenes, from left to right, are the Annunciation, a consort of angels, the Nativity, and finally, on the right, the Resurrection. This is a computer-aided reconstruction, by the way. The piece is now displayed in a museum in its separate parts so that all of it can be viewed at the same time. But hooray for Photoshop. So let's focus on this extraordinary depiction of the resurrection, which is a scene that relatively few painters have attempted to capture. What techniques has Grünewald used to portray this central moment in the Christian narrative? Well, obviously, there's a very vivid use of color. Note how Grünewald has applied layers of paint to give the scene an almost translucent glow. The use of juxtaposed complementary colors our attention on the contrast between earthly life and the resurrected life. The painting adds drama, too, with the tumbled soldiers at the bottom, whom the resurrection has thrust to the ground. And now we come to another very important turning point in our course, as we introduce a new medium, printmaking. The invention that more than any other ushered in the Protestant Reformation, and for that matter, transformed history, was the printing press. The printing press spread knowledge and incendiary ideas, such as the notion that people could read and interpret the Bible for themselves. The printing press also created new markets for art in forms that could be easily and inexpensively reproduced. So here's the first major book printed with movable type in Europe, the Gutenberg Bible. Although illustrated printed Bibles would soon follow, these illuminations were actually added by hand. And yes, you're going to need to keep these various kinds of printing straight eventually. For now, I'll focus on the two types of printmaking that appeared in this artistic period and in our two required works. On the left, you see a woodblock print created by the most famous print artist of all time, and probably also the most famous German painter, Albrecht Dürer. The work on the right is our required work by Dürer. It's an engraving rather than a woodcut. Note how much more detail the artist can include. I hope you watched the podcast about Dürer's paintings and read the essay on our Dürer required work, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, let's watch another Khan Academy video, this one a more general discussion of woodcuts and engraving. Pay attention to the advantages and disadvantages of each method. Note that the allegory of law and grace, a required work I'll talk about in my last lecture for this unit, is a woodcut. Dürer's paintings do not appear on our required works list, which distressed me since I think he is one of the greatest painters in art history. Dürer was the Leonardo da Vinci of the Northern Renaissance. Like some of his Italian Renaissance counterparts, Dürer was the son and apprentice of a goldsmith, but as a teenager he turned to making woodcuts for the booming new publishing industry. Like Leonardo, Dürer was also a humanist scholar, a mathematician, a scientist, and a superbly skilled publicist who actually made serious money from his art. Dürer took two long trips to Italy, and he made friends with many of our Italian high Renaissance superstars, including Raphael. He helped bring Italian Renaissance mathematical perspective and humanist learning to Germany, but he remained a very northern figure, especially when he embraced Protestantism in the last decade of his life. This woodcut is so famous and such a longtime College Board favorite that I'm including it even though it's not a required work. The woodcut has hundreds of individually carved lines. The carving would usually be done by a skilled craftsman working from the artist's drawings, but we know that Dürer sometimes did his own carving as well. The theme comes from the book of Revelation, and the four disasters are death, famine, war, and pestilence or disease. Death is the emaciated old man. Famine swings the scales that will weigh human souls. War wields a sword, and pestilence draws a bow. This engraving, again, not woodcut, of Adam and Eve is a required work. It highlights Dürer's extraordinary skill as an engraver. Cross-hatching, you'll remember, is the use of perpendicular lines to convey volume and modeling. Here we see Adam grasping the tree of life. The plaque hanging from the branch contains Dürer's signature in Latin. The branch Adam holds is from a mountain ash, which was identified as the tree of life in many traditions, including Greek and Norse mythology, because it was a very long-lived tree. Eve, meanwhile, has broken off a branch of the fig, the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil. 4 of the animals represent the medieval idea that all individuals displayed one of 4 temperaments. The cat is choleric, independent, decisive, goal-oriented. The rabbit is sanguine, enthusiastic, active, and social. The ox is phlegmatic, relaxed, peaceful, quiet. And the elk is melancholic, analytical, detail-oriented, and a deep thinker and feeler. Who'd have guessed that elk were deep thinkers? What this image is expressing is that before the fall, these humors were held in check, controlled by man's innocence. Once Adam and Eve ate from the apple of knowledge, all 4 of the humors were activated, and innocence was gone. Humans of different temperaments began to clash with each other, and individuals gave in to the worst elements of their natures. In other words, sin had entered the world. The nudes show the profound Italian influence on Dürer's work. Most Northern Renaissance and certainly most Reformation works of art do not depict nudes. Dürer was also influenced by classical sculpture, and like Michelangelo, he based his Adam on the ancient sculpture of Apollo Belvedere. Here's a side-by-side comparison with the Apollo Belvedere. Remember that this sculpture also had a significant influence on Michelangelo. Like Polyclitus, like Leonardo, Dürer believed that the perfect human form corresponded to a precise system of proportion and measurements. Near the end of his life, Dürer wrote several books codifying his mathematical theories. Here we see his fascination with ideal form. The first man and woman appear in nearly symmetrical, idealized poses, each with the weight on one leg, the other leg bent, and each with one arm angled slightly upward from the elbow and somewhat away from the body. Do you remember the terms for the relaxed posture and that balance of opposites? Contrapposto and symmetria. The details give you a sense of Dürer's complete mastery of the art of engraving. I find the cat's fur especially impressive. So here's another famous Dürer engraving. I could really imagine this showing up as an attribution question. And here's still another famous Dürer engraving, a personification of melancholy, filled with symbols from astronomy, mathematics, alchemy, and the art of carpentry. Again, remember that Dürer was a Renaissance scholar, as well as an artist and a craftsman. This painting reveals another side of Dürer's extraordinary drawing and painting skills. Like many Renaissance scholars, such as Leonardo, he was deeply interested in natural science. I love this painting, so I just had to stick it in. This painting reveals not only Dürer's skills as a portraitist, but also his late-in-life embrace of Reformation theology. Dürer was not a Protestant when he created our required works in 1504. After all, Martin Luther wouldn't kick off the Protestant Reformation until 1517. But less than 5 months after Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, he received a gift from Dürer as a token of the artist's admiration for his religious ideas. By 1520, Dürer had collected many of Luther's writings, and his art became increasingly Protestant. Dürer did not attack the Catholic Church in his art, but after 1517, his art was increasingly Protestant in that he abandoned the depiction of popular saints. He portrayed the leading reformers and their supporters in a heroic light, and he emphasized the exclusive authority of the Bible in personal and civic worship. This famous painting reveals both the strong influence of high Renaissance Italian painting, these could be Titian's, and his now Protestant theology. Note that St. John in the red robe overshadows St. Peter, the fellow with the beard. And note, too, that Peter is holding his famous keys to the kingdom over not St. Peter's Cathedral, but the Bible. In my final lecture for this unit, I will look at the Protestant Reformation in more detail and explore a required work that is in many ways a theological treatise engraved.